Elias Brooks inherits a piece of burned-out land on the edge of Redfield, legally, officially, nothing hidden, nothing owed. And before he even sets his first tool down, people are already laughing, already telling him he's wasting his life. Not because he broke a rule, not because he took anything from anyone, but because that land had been dead for years. Dead. They told him to walk away. He didn't. And what they didn't know was that Elias wasn't trying to prove them wrong. He was about to wake something up. What would you have done? Drop it in the comments. And where are you watching from? A dry wind dragged dust across the cracked roads of Redfield, the late summer sun hanging heavy and unmoving, as if even the sky had grown tired of this place. Elias Brooks stood alone at the edge of town, a worn duffel bag hanging from his shoulder, his shadow stretched thin against the brittle ground. At 19, his body was lean but hardened by quiet endurance, his dark skin carrying the faint sheen of sweat under the relentless heat. His eyes, deep, observant, older than they should be, rested not on the town behind him, but on the land ahead. Behind him stood Calvin Brooks, his older cousin, a tall man in his early 30s, broad-shouldered but softened by years of comfort rather than labor. His neatly pressed shirt and polished boots spoke of someone who had never needed to struggle for survival. Calvin's voice had always carried a certain cold authority, shaped by a life where control mattered more than connection. "I'm not throwing you out," Calvin said, though his tone made it clear this was generosity only in name. "But I'm not keeping you either." He gestured lazily toward the horizon. The land stretched out in a dull, ashen expanse, blackened patches of soil, skeletal remains of what might have once been crops, and a collapsed wooden shack leaning as if it had given up long ago. It was a place the town had already forgotten. "That's yours," Calvin added. "If you can make something of it, good for you." There was a pause, not long, but long enough to carry the weight of everything unspoken. Elias nodded once. No anger, no pleading, just acceptance. Calvin watched him for a moment longer, perhaps expecting resistance, perhaps hoping for it, something to justify the distance he had already placed between them. But Elias offered nothing, and with a small, dismissive shake of his head, Calvin turned away, his boots kicking up dust as he walked back toward the truck. The engine roared to life, loud and indifferent. Then it was gone. Silence returned, not the peaceful kind, the kind that presses against your chest and asks what you're going to do next. Elias adjusted the strap on his shoulder and began walking. Each step onto the land felt different, as if the ground itself was watching him, testing him. The air carried a faint, bitter scent of ash, long settled, but never fully gone. Somewhere in the distance, a piece of loose metal creaked softly, moved by the wind like a forgotten memory trying to speak. He reached the shack. Up close, it was worse than it had looked from afar. The roof had partially collapsed, wooden beams splintered and gray with age. The door hung crooked on a single hinge, swaying slightly. Inside, shadows pooled thickly, hiding whatever remained of its past. Elias didn't go in, not yet. Instead, he crouched down slowly, setting his bag beside him. His fingers hovered above the ground for a moment, hesitating, as if unsure whether this place would accept him. Then he touched the soil. It was dry, cracked, lifeless to anyone else. But Elias didn't pull his hand away. His thumb pressed lightly into the surface, breaking apart a thin layer of hardened earth. Beneath it, just barely, there was a different texture, finer, cooler, not alive, but not completely gone either. A memory surfaced, his mother's voice, soft but steady, spoken years ago on a night when the world had still felt whole. "Nothing in this world is truly dead, Elias," she had said, her hands covered in dirt as she worked a small garden behind their old home. "Some things are just waiting for the right kind of patience." He swallowed. The heat, the silence, the emptiness of the land, it all pressed in on him at once. For a fleeting second, doubt flickered, not loud, not overwhelming, just enough to be dangerous. What if they were right? What if this place was exactly what they said it was? Finished, useless, beyond saving. Elias exhaled slowly. His hand tightened slightly against the soil. "No," he murmured under his breath. his voice barely louder than the wind, not because he was certain, but because he refused to leave with nothing. He stood, brushing the dust from his hands, and finally stepped toward the shack. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound sharp in the stillness. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten time. It wasn't much, but it was something. Elias set his bag down in the corner and looked around, not with disappointment, but with quiet calculation. What could be fixed? What had to be rebuilt? What could still be used? Outside, the wind shifted slightly, carrying with it a faint whisper across the land. It wasn't a voice, not really, but if someone had been standing there long enough, they might have believed it was. And for the first time since arriving, Elias allowed himself a small, almost invisible smile. Because beneath the silence, he thought he heard something answer back. Morning came quietly over the scorched land, not with hope, but with a pale, reluctant light that revealed every flaw without mercy. Elias woke on the rough wooden floor of the shack, his back stiff, his throat dry, and his body still adjusting to the unfamiliar silence of a place with no past worth remembering. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the broken ceiling above him, where thin beams of sunlight slipped through like hesitant promises. Then he exhaled, slow and steady, and pushed himself up. There was no plan written out for him, no clear path, only the weight of the decision he had already made, to stay. The first task was simple in theory, clear what remained. In practice, it felt like dismantling a grave. Charred wood crumbled beneath his hands as he dragged broken beams away from the shack. Ash rose into the air with every movement, clinging to his skin, his clothes, even his breath. By midday, his arms burned, his palms blistered. But the land looked only slightly different, barely touched by his effort. It would have been easy to stop, to call it pointless. But Elias didn't stop, because stopping would mean admitting the land was right about him, and he wasn't ready to be another thing this place had buried. By the second day, he turned his attention to water. The memory of dry soil beneath his fingers lingered in his mind like an unfinished sentence. If anything was going to change, it would start there. He found an old rusted bucket behind the shack, its handle bent but still usable, and began walking. The path to the nearest stream stretched farther than it looked, over a mile of uneven ground, scattered with rocks and brittle weeds. The sun pressed down relentlessly, turning each step into a quiet negotiation between will and exhaustion. By the time he reached the stream, his shirt clung to his back, soaked through, and his legs trembled faintly. The water itself was narrow but steady, weaving through stones polished smooth by time. Elias crouched beside it, dipping the bucket slowly, watching the ripples settle. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to simply sit there, listening, not just to the water, but to the absence of everything else. It reminded him of something. Not the land, himself. On the way back, the weight of the water dragged at his arm, each step heavier than the last. He spilled some along the way, inevitable, frustrating, but he didn't curse, didn't rush. He adjusted, balanced, learned. That became his rhythm. Day after day, he carried water, cleared debris, broke apart hardened soil with whatever tools he could salvage. He experimented in small, almost invisible ways, mixing ash into the dirt, layering scraps of organic matter he scavenged from the edges of the town. None of it worked immediately. And that was when they started to notice him. At first, it was just passing glances. Then came the laughter. One afternoon, as Elias knelt in the dirt, pressing damp soil between his fingers, a voice cut through the still air. "You know that's not going to do anything, right?" Elias looked up. Standing a few yards away was Martha Hale, a woman in her late 50s, with sharp eyes and a posture that spoke of years spent surviving rather than living. Her gray hair was pulled back tightly, and her worn coat hung loosely over her thin frame. Martha had lived in Redfield all her life, watching it change, shrink, and harden, experiences that had carved skepticism deep into her bones. "That land's been dead longer than you've been alive," she added, crossing her arms. Elias studied her for a moment, not with defiance, but with quiet curiosity. "Maybe," he said simply. Martha let out a short, dry laugh. "Maybe?" He looked back down at the soil in his hands. Or maybe it just hasn't been listened to. That caught her off guard, not because it convinced her, but because it didn't try to. She shook her head, muttering something under her breath before turning away. But she didn't leave immediately. She lingered, just for a second longer than necessary, watching him return to work. Elias didn't notice, or maybe he did, and chose not to show it. That night, as he sat outside the shack, his hands aching, his body heavy with exhaustion, he stared out across the land. It looked the same as before, still broken, still empty. But he knew something had changed. Not out there, in here. The doubt hadn't disappeared. It had simply quieted. And in its place, something else had begun to take root. Not confidence. Not yet. But belief. Small, fragile, and alive. The morning air carried a sharp chill, thin frost clinging to the edges of the broken earth, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Elias's hands were numb before the sun had even risen fully. The shovel felt heavier than usual, its worn handle biting into his palms as he drove it down again and again into the stubborn ground. Days had blurred together, effort without visible reward, motion without change. But something had shifted inside him. The doubt that once whispered had grown quieter, replaced by a rhythm: dig, lift, break, repeat. He didn't expect anything different that morning. That was why he almost missed it. The sound. A dull, softer thud. Elias paused, his breath catching slightly as he pressed the shovel down again. This time, the resistance gave way more easily. He frowned, kneeling down, brushing aside the loose soil with his fingers. The texture was different here. Cooler, finer, almost alive. His pulse quickened, though he didn't let himself believe it yet. Not until he dug deeper. Each movement became more deliberate now, slower, careful, as if the ground might take the discovery back if he rushed. The soil darkened gradually, shifting from brittle gray to a muted brown. Then, as his fingers pushed into the earth, something gave beneath them: moisture. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint dampness clinging to his skin. But Elias froze, staring at his hand as if it had just touched something sacred. He pressed deeper, and this time, the earth responded. A thin line of water seeped through. Not a gush, not a miracle, just a quiet, persistent trickle. Elias exhaled, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for weeks. He didn't shout, didn't celebrate. Instead, he leaned back slightly, staring at the small patch of wet soil as if it might vanish if he blinked too fast. "This is enough," he murmured softly. Because it was. Enough to prove the land wasn't empty. Enough to prove he wasn't wrong. The work changed after that. Not easier, never easier, but clearer. Elias began shaping shallow channels, guiding the fragile stream outward, using broken wood and scattered stones to direct the flow. Every drop mattered now. Every mistake could cost him what little he had found. He worked longer hours, ignoring the ache in his back, the sting in his hands. There was no urgency in his movements, only precision, like someone learning the language of something that didn't use words. By midday, the first narrow line of damp earth stretched across the surface, cutting through the dry land like a quiet promise. That was when someone noticed. "Well, I'll be damned." Elias looked up. Leaning against a crooked fence post at the edge of the property was Jonah Reed, a man in his early 40s with a sunburned face and a permanent squint, as if he had spent too many years staring into disappointment. His clothes were worn but practical, the kind of man who had worked the land long enough to respect it, and long enough to resent it when it failed him. Years ago, Jonah had lost his own farm after a drought wiped out everything he'd built, a loss that had hardened him into someone who trusted results more than hope. Jonah stepped closer, boots crunching against the dry ground. His eyes moved from Elias to the thin stream of water, and back again. "You dig that yourself?" he asked. His tone caught somewhere between disbelief and caution. Elias nodded once. Jonah crouched down, running his fingers through the damp soil. He didn't smile, didn't praise, but something in his expression shifted, subtle, almost reluctant. "Huh," he muttered. Didn't think there was anything left under here. Elias wiped his hands against his pants. Neither did anyone else. Jonah let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. Careful, he said, standing up. Places like this, they give you just enough to keep you trying. Then they take it all back. Elias met his gaze, steady but calm. Maybe, he said, or maybe they're waiting to see who stays. Jonah studied him for a moment longer, then shook his head slightly, stepping back. You're either stubborn or stupid. Elias didn't respond, because for the first time, he wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. Jonah lingered for a second, then turned, walking away without another word. But he didn't laugh, didn't dismiss it. And that mattered more than Elias expected. By evening, the land looked different, not transformed, not healed, but changed. Small patches of darkened soil marked where the water had touched. Tiny, almost invisible signs. But they were there. Elias stood at the edge of the field, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, his hands trembling slightly from overuse. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something else. Responsibility. Because now that the land had answered him, he had to answer back. And as the last light of day faded across Redfield, something quiet began to spread. Not just through the soil, but through the town itself. Not belief, not yet, but attention. And sometimes, that's where everything begins. Winter did not arrive gently in Redfield. It came like a quiet reckoning, the kind that does not shout, but leaves nothing untouched. The first snow fell softly, covering the broken land in a fragile illusion of peace. But Elias knew better. Beneath that white silence, the ground was tightening, hardening, testing everything he had built. Each morning he stepped outside before the light fully settled, breaking thin layers of ice along the channels he had carved weeks before, ensuring the water still moved, slow, stubborn, alive. The land did not thrive, but it endured. And in winter, endurance was the only language that mattered. Across Redfield, the larger farms began to fail. Machines froze. Fuel ran thin. Systems that once worked perfectly now collapsed under conditions they were never meant to survive. Crops died in rows, stiff and lifeless, as if the land itself had turned its back. Elias watched none of it directly. He didn't need to. He could feel it, in the silence of the wind, in the absence of distant machinery, in the way the town seemed to hold its breath longer each day. By the time the storm came in full force, it was no longer a surprise. The sky darkened for days, snow falling heavier, faster, until the world shrank to whatever stood within a few feet of sight. The wind howled through the land, not violently, but persistently, like something determined to wear everything down. Elias adjusted. He reinforced the shack with what little he had, sealing gaps, lowering his living space slightly into the ground to trap warmth. He rationed carefully, moved deliberately, checked the water twice as often. There was no panic in him, only focus. On the 6th day of the storm, he heard something unfamiliar. Footsteps. Uneven. Slow. Elias stepped outside, the cold biting instantly into his skin. Through the thick white air, a figure emerged. Calvin. But not the same man who had left him here. Calvin's shoulders were hunched, his movements slower, heavier. The confidence that once defined him had been stripped away, replaced by something quieter, something closer to truth. His clothes were no longer clean, his posture no longer certain. I didn't think, Calvin started, then stopped, his breath visible in the freezing air. I didn't think it would get this bad. Elias said nothing, because this wasn't about words. It's all gone, Calvin continued, voice lower now. The fuel, the crops, everything. The wind filled the space between them. For a moment it felt like the past stood there too. Every decision, every dismissal, every moment Elias had been left behind. Calvin shifted slightly, as if unsure whether to step closer or turn back, and that hesitation said more than anything else. Elias looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, just with clarity. Then he stepped aside. A small movement, but enough. Calvin exhaled slowly, stepping forward without another word. Inside the shack, the air was still cold, but it held something else now. Not just survival, but change. Because the storm had taken everything unnecessary, and what remained was real. Spring did not arrive as a celebration. It arrived as a quiet return, melting away what winter had stripped bare. The snow receded slowly, revealing the land not as it once was, but as something in between. Not dead, not fully alive. Waiting. Elias was already outside when the first true warmth touched the ground. His hands moved with the same steady rhythm, clearing, adjusting, guiding. The channels held. The soil, though cold, retained moisture. Small signs, barely visible, began to appear. Not growth, but possibility. Behind him, Calvin worked in silence. The man who once gave orders now followed instructions without question. His movements were rough at first, unpracticed, but persistent. He did not complain. He did not stop. Something in him had shifted, not suddenly, but completely. On the third morning, more footsteps came. This time, not alone. Lena Carter stood at the edge of the land, a woman in her late 20s, her face worn by sleepless nights, her hands marked by years of careful work. She had once been known for her precision on one of Redfield's largest farms, until its collapse forced her into uncertainty. Since then, she had learned to trust slowly, to believe only what she could see. "I heard things are still working here," she said, her voice cautious. Elias didn't answer with reassurance. He handed her a tool. Lena hesitated only a second before taking it, and that was enough. By the end of the week, others followed. Among them was Thomas Hale, a man in his 50s with a quiet presence, his posture slightly bent from decades of labor that had never quite paid off. Unlike his sister Martha, Thomas did not question. He observed. Years of failure had not made him bitter, only careful. The land began to change, not dramatically, but undeniably. More hands meant more work. More work meant more adjustments, more learning, more small improvements that built upon each other. Elias did not lead with authority. He showed, then stepped back. Let them see, let them understand, because that was the only way it would last. The first true green appeared days later, small, fragile, easy to miss. But no one missed it. Silence fell across the field as people noticed. Not the silence of doubt, the silence of recognition. Martha came again. This time, she didn't stand at a distance. "I was wrong," she said simply. Elias shook his head slightly. "You just didn't have a reason to believe yet. That was all, because belief, like the land, couldn't be forced. It had to be grown." Weeks passed. Redfield changed. Not through miracles, but through understanding, through patience, through the quiet decision, repeated daily, to not give up too soon. One evening, Calvin stood beside Elias, looking out over the land. "There's better land closer to town," he said, after a long pause. "Easier, more reliable." Elias didn't look at him. "I know," he said. Calvin waited. Elias didn't move. "I'm staying here." No hesitation. Because this land, once dismissed, once forgotten, was no longer what it had been, and neither was he. The wind moved gently across the fields, carrying something new. Not hope, not yet, but something stronger. Proof. Under the quiet sky of Redfield, as the once-forgotten land began to breathe again, something deeper became clear. Miracles don't come from perfection. They come from faith and perseverance. Elias didn't change the land with strength. He changed it with belief, a belief that reflects something many of us forget in everyday life. God never abandons what he has created. Sometimes he is simply waiting for someone patient enough to begin again, and brave enough to keep going when everything seems lost. Just like that land, maybe you, or someone you love, have felt overlooked, broken, or left behind. But this story is a reminder. No life is worthless. No place is too far gone for a new beginning. And sometimes, in our darkest moments, God is quietly preparing a restoration we cannot yet see. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment with a blessing, a prayer, or simply where you're watching from. Let's build a space of faith together. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more stories like this. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your path, no matter where you are in your journey.
If you feel something from this story, leave a comment and hit subscribe. More stories are waiting on hidden blacktail.